Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Chandler Collins. Chandler is currently a Ph.D. candidate student at Bar Ilan University, and he's working on Jerusalem during the Iron Age. But he's also interested in the biblical city. He obviously studied and worked in Jerusalem, but more importantly, he was stuck in Jerusalem during COVID. So we're certainly going to hear his views about Jerusalem during that particular period of time. And he recently started a newsletter, Approaching Jerusalem. I will post the link in the podcast notes, but we're certainly going to delve into that later throughout the podcast. But first things first, Chandler, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto. It's good to be here, and I'm a big fan of your podcast, so it's especially wonderful to be invited to participate.
Thank you so much. So I want to ask you just something about yourself. You can tell us a little bit more about your background, and more importantly, how did you come to work on Jerusalem during the Iron Age, which we could probably define the period of like the 8th to the 6th century BC, so a fairly long time ago.
Yeah, well, I hail from the American Midwest. I grew up in Michigan, and then by way of Chicago, ended up studying in Jerusalem as a part of my graduate work when I was at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago. And I studied at a small American school there on Mount Zion named Jerusalem University College. And several years later, I ended up going back and joining the staff at the university and served there for 4 years. And so my Jerusalem is mainly informed by those experiences. I've done archaeological digs in different parts of the country, and been all over, both teaching just on my own excursions, but also teaching student groups. I taught a semester course there on the geography of the biblical world, and did a lot of exploring around the city, especially during the end, during COVID, the end of my residency there. And the whole package kind of gave me an amazing appreciation for Jerusalem from the biblical city onward, really.
So I gather that your Jerusalem started from a religious background, but also moved into archaeology. And so I was wondering, how did you start then having an interest in the very early period of the history of Jerusalem?
Yeah, you're right. I grew up, Protestant evangelical, and my entry point to Jerusalem, as a lot of people's was via the Bible. You grow up hearing stories and, picturing what Jerusalem was like, and then studying it in grad school. You may learn some more academic, technical things about it, but visiting it for myself was a very different experience, and something that I could never have learned, outside of that context. I just kind of followed the natural trajectory that my experience laid out for itself. I mean, I took courses when I was studying in Jerusalem, and when I was on staff there also, I audited courses on the city, the ancient city. And of course, you're walking around, you're seeing excavations take place all the time because infrastructure is being put in, and new infrastructure in the city. And, when they break ground, if they hit ancient architecture, the Israel Antiquities Authority will excavate there. So you're seeing those kind of, the more observant, people walking around will notice that. You also see large scale excavations, and it's just kind of part of the urban landscape over there. More so in certain parts of the city than others. But all that just kind of drove me to try to explain or understand, I guess, the stories I had grown up hearing and what I was seeing on the landscape.
On the podcast, I discussed with a few individuals archaeological excavations like the Givati parking lot, obviously Silwan, the question of the city of David. But we never really talked about, again, the very early period. So I was wondering if you can give us a sense of how Jerusalem would have looked like.
So when we talk about Iron Age Jerusalem, if we maybe can rewind, before the Iron Age, beginning of the Iron Age, back into would be the second millennium, BCE, in the Bronze Age, and even earlier. We have these early remains kind of clustered in an area of Jerusalem that's around the perennial spring there, probably the biblical Gihon spring. In Arabic, it's Ain Siti Miriam, and the early remains are clustered around the water source, which you might expect. And there's some early buildings there, even from the third millennium BCE. And there's a fortification wall found in several parts of the hill from the Middle Bronze Age. That's the second millennium BCE. And then, things really pick up in the city in terms of, built infrastructure that's been uncovered into the Iron Age too. And that's what you mentioned, the 8th through the 6th centuries. So the kind of the beginning and toward the middle of the first millennium, there's some evidence for earlier remains there. And that's when you get into debates about King David, King Solomon, and the early Judaic kingdom, this in the so-called United Monarchy. So the focus of my research is toward the end of the Iron Age. And basically, if we can chart out the growth of Jerusalem, the way most scholars discuss it, it would start in this area around the spring that I mentioned earlier. And from that point, most scholars believe that when the temple was built, the Judite temple was built on the Temple Mount, the city extended to the north then to accommodate that. So the ancient core would be clustered on the southeastern hill, Wadi Helway today, or part of Silwan. And then it came to include the Temple Mount. So you would have what you would expect in an ancient Near Eastern city, which is your temple at a high point, right, to the main deity. And as far as we can tell, the royal palace, built adjacent to it, although there's not remains of the royal palace or the temple building, proper that have been uncovered. There's probably a lot of reasons for that, but this is the structure of the city. Basically, we assume the 10th century BC and most of the 9th century BCE. And once you get into the end of the Iron Age too, say the 8th century, there's an interesting development that happens in Jerusalem, which is that the city grows onto what's called the Western Hill, or modern Mount Zion. It would include the modern Armenian and Jewish quarters as well. And there's evidence of the city growing onto the Western Hill and growing in a way that would not have been expected from the point of view of the people who first settled ancient Jerusalem. So the city comes to include two different ridge lines: the eastern ridge line with the ancient core of the city and the Temple Mount, Haram HaSharif today, and then the western ridge line. And so it's kind of these dual ridge lines with a pronounced valley in the middle. What the Jewish historian Josephus calls the Tyropoean Valley. Most scholars call it the Central Valley today, or where Elwad Street runs in the old city. So it's it's a city with an interesting urban dynamic, because the Western Hill is higher than the Eastern Hill, kind of the ideological core of the city, where you had the sacred precinct and the royal palace. And so I'm very interested in that, the interplay in the dynamic between those two ridgelines.
I'm curious about the demographics of a city. Do we have any evidence about the number of people that may have lived in Jerusalem and who may have been? I mean, were they all part of the same group? Do we have people coming from outside Jerusalem and settle in Jerusalem? Do they practice all the same religion, or is a mixed city in that sense?
That's a really good question and very hard to answer. From an archaeological point of view, population estimates are difficult because what you do is you take a given size of terrain, in hectares, let's say, and multiply it by a density coefficient. And different archaeologists will use different coefficients, right, depending on how densely populated you assume a given space would be. And so it's not exactly easy to figure out. We also, there's a lot of archaeological unknowns in Jerusalem, right, because so much of the city has not been and cannot be excavated. So you see a wide range in the population estimates for the Iron Age city. Some scholars assume it was a true metropolis of tens of thousands of people, and others, would take a smaller number and would see it as more sparsely populated. But the trajectory in ancient Near Eastern history is that as you get closer and closer to the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE, Jerusalem and Judah are really the last territory standing as the Assyrian Empire has been, taking over and destroying kingdoms between them and Egypt. And Judah's the last one that really remains. And so probably they were able to enrich themselves by being a vassal state of Assyria. And we see this growth in the archaeology, particularly in the 7th century BCE, where we see luxury imports. For example, there was a jar that was found in the Givati parking lot excavations, which is just outside of Dungate. And they did a residue analysis on the inside of the jar, and it revealed not only that it held wine, but that wine was flavored with vanilla. And so there has to be a vast trade network to bring this vanilla all the way maybe from India up to Jerusalem. And there's other, luxury goods like that tell us that Jerusalem was integrated into, both integrated into a network to bring these things into the city, and also that the elite and royalty of the city benefited from these trade networks. As far as you asked about the people who lived in Jerusalem, and maybe if we know where they came from, and that's also a hard question to answer. The Bible mentions a people called the Jebusites that David conquered in 2 Samuel 5 and 1 Chronicles 11. There's different theories about who these people were and if they may or may not have been connected to some earlier people who we know lived there from cuneiform documents called the Amarna letters. I don't want to get too in the weeds here. But as we fast forward in time, the Western Hill begins to be populated, like we talked about earlier. There is one idea that's been floating around in scholarship for the last 40 years, let's say, that there was a massive wave of refugees that came into Jerusalem and populated the Western Hill from Israel, from the northern kingdom of Israel, after it was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. And leading up to, in the decades leading up to, as the Assyrians began to make incursions into the southern Levant. That view was created to explain why there could be such a massive population explosion in Jerusalem at the, toward the end of the 8th century. But now archaeologists, I would say most archaeologists are kind of tempering that view and seeing the growth onto the Western Hill as more natural growth over time, and seeing it as beginning earlier, not as a population explosion at the end of the 8th century, but as a gradual growth beginning at the middle or beginning of the 8th century, and even some scholars would put at the beginning or at the very end of the 9th century. So that doesn't mean that there weren't some refugees who ended up in Jerusalem, and maybe who even were living on the Western Hill, but we're not exactly fully able to explain it. That's one of the reasons I wanted to write my dissertation on the Western Hill. So I'm knee deep in research right now, looking at not only the known archaeology of the Western Hill, but also some of the data points from around the outskirts of the Western Hill, like tombs, for example, Iron Age tombs that were found on the edge of the Western Hill, and what some of the finds in there may tell us about the people who lived there.
Digging in Jerusalem means to dig through an almost unlimited number of layers of history that piles up on top of each other. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the most difficult aspects of your work as an archaeologist, looking at this particular period in time and location in Jerusalem. And also, if you could tell us what would make you the new Indiana Jones, what would be the discovery that would make you like, oh, here I'm, a game changer. I found something that is going to rewrite the history of Jerusalem in the Iron Age period.
Well, that's a big question. First of all, I have to say I've never excavated myself in Jerusalem. I've seen excavations happening. Like I said, I've excavated elsewhere, and I study the archaeological reports. So that's a big part of it, is both poring through the material, looking at what's been published, both in scientific reports, those big books that people see in the library with a lot of technical information, and looking at journal articles, the discussions in the journals. There's also conferences that take place every year on the archaeology of Jerusalem. A lot of that is published in Hebrew, some of it's published in English. And so it's going through that material as well. It's a lifetime's worth of material, for sure. That's part of the process. And part of it, I think, also is really being there on the ground and knowing the topography well. Some discussions will be, will include maps and detailed information about the geography of the city. But if you haven't been there and you haven't walked it, you can't fully appreciate the weight of the argument, in a given publication. So I think for me, I've really drawn on my experience having been there in reading through a lot of these excavations. That's part of it. And, as far as what would be a find that would rewrite history, I mean, there's so many. There are so many you could list from so many different periods, right? Because when you dig in Jerusalem, let's say your interest is in the Bronze Age city, the earliest city, or the Iron Age city, or in all the periods, it becomes infectious at some point across the board. No matter what you're interested in, you have to deal both with the geography of the city and everything between you and that period. So if you're going to go excavate, let's say, in a given spot, you deal with you have the visible architecture around it on the ground, right? And then you begin digging through the stratigraphy, assuming that you have different parts of Jerusalem were dug out down to bedrock in later periods. So sometimes all that's been obliterated by, let's say, the Romans or the Byzantines. But in some cases, you have good stratigraphy, and you have to go through everything and appreciate everything, on the way down. So truly, I mean, Jerusalem is every archaeological period is so loaded with questions and difficulties that I could give you many answers for many different periods. But in terms of let's just talk about the Iron Age on the Western Hill, if we can narrow it. If we could find, and there have been pieces of this that have probably been unearthed over the last 40 years, 50 years, but if we could find a clear, indisputable piece of the fortification wall of the Iron Age city, on the Western Hill, particularly the southern part of the Western Hill, or the Western. We have some of it maybe on the Western line, but if we could find a nice big chunk of it that was indisputable, I think that would help to clinch the view that the entire Western Hill was fortified, basically from Jaffa Gate all the way down to, I mentioned Jerusalem University College earlier. That's the old Bishop Gobat school buildings there, and around the Protestant cemetery. And then, down toward the bottom of Silwan is where we think the fortification wall ran. So a piece of that would be helpful. And, there's also debates about how people living on the Western Hill got their water. A lot of scholars believe that the so-called Pool of Siloam, or whatever the precursor was for that back in the Iron Age, was the water source for the people living on the Western Hill. But people in Jerusalem have subsisted on cistern water for a long time, even into the Ottoman period and in the British Mandate. And so it could be that they use cisterns on the Western Hill, but we don't have any evidence of that yet. So finding an Iron Age cistern would also be helpful. But the data is so sparse because the Western Hill is so densely occupied, and the place that's been the most excavated, as you probably know, is in the modern Jewish quarter, which was reconstructed after 1967, and there's a whole host of issues involved in that. But the reconstruction allowed the opportunity to excavate there, and so that's where we have the most data from, and then other parts of the Western Hill as well. But a lot of it is spotty. So in other words, you're looking at what one archaeologist or a team of archaeologists found at an area where they were, building a foundation for a new building, or repairing a sewer drain, or fixing part of a road. And so part of looking at all of this archaeological material is finding a way to connect all of those dots and try to make a reasonable case for what the city looked like. It's a difficult process.
I always been fascinated by the work of archaeologists, whether digging or studying, but I always been very aware of the fact that I would never be a good one, because I don't have the patience to wait for the digs, for all of the small pieces to come up, and working with very little evidence. So I always tell myself I'm happy that I work on the 19th and early 20th century, where I do have a lot of more sources available. I want to ask you something about archaeology and its political use. Now, but let me start with this story. So I have a very good friend who's working for Haaretz, and she was telling me that the section dedicated to archaeology is the most clicked on Haaretz online right after the news. So you have the majority of readers clicking the news about the politics of Israel and Palestine. And the second most clicked section is, in fact, archaeology. And that's where they're investing a lot of money also in commercials and, keeping that section alive with a lot of news. And a few times we had discussions about it. So I said, how do you select the stories? Well, and she was telling me that sometimes they just have a backup of stories, and they select them also according to the politics of the day, whether it's Jewish holidays, whether it's the contemporary unfolding of events. And that made me think about this different kind of use of archaeology in political terms, something that probably I will deal with at some point. But I was wondering, in your views, what's your take on the clear use of archaeology for contemporary issues, and mostly political contemporary issues?
Yeah, you raise an interesting point, which is that there are a lot of people interested in this stuff, and they are, I'm not surprised to hear that about Haaretz, that their archaeology section actually is the second most popular. I see articles all the time like that, whether it's Jerusalem Post or Times of Israel or whatever outlet. One of the things that I have my students do actually is to do a critical reading of several pop media archaeological stories, and to evaluate the headline, because headlines are usually sensationalized right, to draw your click, and then to examine the ways in the body of the story that people will use the Bible or other, well-known texts or ancient stories to draw out elements of the archaeology that may or may not be fair actually to the data, right? So learning to read the data in the story, and I have them write their own headline for it, to an unsensational headline. That's not to say that nothing that comes out of pop media is helpful, and it certainly keeps people up to date on new finds or the ways that archaeology is being developed in Israel, Palestine. So but that's interesting. As far as the politicization of archaeology, I mean, there's a lot that's been written on that and is continuing to be written. Jerusalem is, it's a mess in a lot of ways, right? And you hear that word, if you know Hebrew and Arabic, you hear that word in those languages just walking around the city. But I try to work on all sides of the city and to appreciate data whatever context it emerges from. So when you have a team of archaeologists, digging and finding clear stratigraphy, like we talked about earlier, or architecture and ceramics, pottery, or whatever comes out of that excavation, it's my job as a researcher to take that data seriously and evaluate it, right? And evaluate the conclusions of the archaeologists who publish that data and interact with all of that. So that's one, side of it. And then there's another side where I was living in the city, or you're teaching student groups in the city, walking around and engaging and seeing the way that archaeology has reshaped the landscape of Jerusalem, especially since 1967, but even earlier, right? And so engaging that and appreciating it, means seeing the ways that development affects residents and the way that it's displayed. Are certain periods being fronted over others, things like that. I think sometimes those processes get conflated with the archaeological process itself, right? And in these excavations, you have well-trained professional archaeologists who are doing, excavations with good methodology in most cases. And then the dig is published, and then it's developed into a national park, and there's two different sides of the coin there, if that makes sense. There are excavations in Sowan that have been criticized actually from archaeologists in the field for their methodology. So there are some there that, for example, the horizontal tunneling that's uncovering the so-called pilgrimage road, I call it the Siloam Road, between the Birkat El Hamra, the Pool of Siloam, and going up the slope from there. It's difficult to dig horizontally and do justice to the stratigraphy. Most all excavations happen from the top down. Another excavation that's happening now is at the Pool of Siloam. And, I'm not in the city to observe this myself, but I've seen a lot of photos from people who've basically shown that some backhoes were taken into that space and a ton of earth was removed without paying careful attention to what was in the dirt. And archaeology is not just about finding architecture, but it's about paying attention to changes in the soil color, and to, small finds within the soil and what that can tell us about different periods in the city of Jerusalem's history. So probably some data was lost there, and it's going to be impossible to know how much. Now I'm seeing that area has been marked out in squares and, is going to be excavated until whatever remains of the Pool of Siloam will be uncovered there. So I try, it's a difficult topic, both because I'm working in that context and want to be fair to the archaeologists who are doing good research and unearthing important data, and also because I love Jerusalem and I want to see all sides of the city treated fairly, And I realized the way that developments that highlight the biblical material only can draw in a lot of tourists and have a detrimental effect on residents, particularly, and I'm thinking of Sowan, obviously, but it could be applied to anywhere in the city.
Talking about Silwan, you have worked for 4 years, if I remember well, and you were on the staff at the Jerusalem University College that you mentioned earlier, which is on Mount Zion, and is very close to borders. Obviously, these are invisible borders. Some of them are officially recognized, the Green Line of 1948-49, and others are less visible, but essentially divide neighborhoods between sort of mostly Jewish neighborhoods and Palestinian ones. And the school, if I remember well, is exactly like in between these locations. And so I was wondering if you can share with us your experience of walking around, crossing these borders, and sort of exploring that side of Jerusalem.
Yeah, I would say that I was pretty privileged to be able to cross the borders and not really carry any baggage with me or fear. In most cases, we also lived on the Russian compound, within the Russian compound. So we also lived kind of on the seam as well. And I could be down the street and to Damascus Gate in 5-10 minutes, and the same, down to Jaffa Gate. So I crossed all sides of Jerusalem all the time and had lots of different experiences in all parts of the city. Like I said, I think that coming from an outside, coming as an outsider, I was able to do that with a lot more fluidity than maybe some residents are either able to do or feel comfortable, to be able to do. Jerusalem is a city that does have invisible borders, like you mentioned. And when you first get there, you have no idea where they are, right? You just kind of, Damascus Gate's over here and Jaffa Gate's over there, Machane Yehuda, et cetera. And the more you live there and understand the city, you begin to feel the borders, slowly.
So you mentioned you were living the other side of Jerusalem and you were walking towards the Jerusalem University College, essentially cutting across the city. And I'm aware that you are interested also in food. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your own experience, given that you literally crossed sides, particularly through the old city. What were your favorite food? And also, if you have memories of what, made you feel like, this is the Jerusalem smell. This is my Jerusalem food.
Well, who doesn't love food? I think one of my favorite experiences being in Jerusalem was getting up and going for early morning walks. The earlier the better to see the city wake up, but let's say 5:30 or 6 in the morning. And one of the things you experience when you do that is all of the smells of the bakeries that are baking their bread for the day, whether it's pita, chubas, or whether it's the Jerusalem bagels. You are drawn in by the smell, and I love fresh bread. I really do. And one of the things I would do is go, buy bread and then ask if I could take photographs of the fresh bread they were making on the cart, or in the oven or whatever. And it's just so delicious to have it right out of the oven. The Jerusalem bagels in particular, because they're so unique. I know you can get them in other places around the country, but there's something about having them there with a little packet of za'atar and being able to enjoy it, as I was walking around the city and watching the city wake up in the morning, maybe get an espresso or Arabic coffee to start the day. I think to me, that's always going to be something that I treasure as a memory living there, and will always do, when I go back. And you're seeing Jerusalem in the morning light, as a photographer, you're catching some really interesting angles of the city as the light's beginning to come through those dark old city streets, and things like that. So you really discover where the bakeries are too, because you may not see them. If you just walk around the city in the afternoon, they've already baked their bread for the day, and the doors are, mostly closed. You'll see, not only will you find the bakeries, but you'll see pita bread hung around on different shops. They just hang it on the doorknobs, or they'll put it on the street, in front of the shop. And then it's just there for the day when the person shows up to open. So when you get up in the morning, you see a different side of the city, as people are planning for the day and waking up, and then you see kids going to school and stuff. And that's probably my answer, is the fresh bread. But we could take that further into the day and say later breakfast or brunch. There's an amazing Georgian food. I hope I don't butcher the name, but it's khachapuri, I think is the name of it. With it's like a bread boat that holds an egg and cheese in the middle with butter, and you rip off parts of the bread and then dip it in the egg and butter. And it's just I've never had anything quite like it. And Jerusalem is such a mishmash of different cultural experiences and different food. I don't know if I would have found that or had that experience, had I not lived there.
I just want to mention to the listeners that Chandler has a very, very cool Instagram profile. I will put the link in the podcast notes, with amazing pictures of Jerusalem and also of bread and pizza. And just because you were mentioning that, I remember the conversation I had with Mahmoud Muna of the bookstore in Jerusalem, and how people have all different favorite places, and sometimes they just go across religious affiliations or identity in general. Like, one of my favorite bakeries, for instance, is at the very end of the Jewish quarters, which I discovered is actually run by Palestinians, which is a very interesting location because it's in between the Armenian quarter and the Jewish quarter, and there's a parking lot there, one of the few inside the old city. And here you have this like Palestinian, been there forever, I would say. And, it's a very unassuming place, which you find in the morning, and as you said, not in the afternoon. And I remember the times that I used to, that I lived in Jerusalem, used to go around the old city. I too would go around and trying to find, my spot where I would find my favorite bread, or the rugelach, or pastries, and, knafe and so forth. So I built this flavor and taste map of Jerusalem, which I believe is unique to everyone in the city. Let me ask about your other work. So in recent time, you started a newsletter, Approaching Jerusalem. Approaching Jerusalem is a collection of articles. There's also a few book reviews. There's also a very, very interesting list of readings about Jerusalem, which I found very useful in many ways. So I was wondering, how did you come up with the idea, and what's the purpose of Approaching Jerusalem?
So initially, I just wanted a space to be able to work out my own work, my own thoughts on different issues in Jerusalem, and things that I really personally wanted to explore for myself. Some of this comes out of my own experience in the city, teaching, really focusing on the biblical city up to the time when it was destroyed by the Romans in the first century, and not really paying close attention to much else. But the longer you live there and the more you research the city and look at the visible architecture, you just begin to want to break out of that and look at all periods of the city. There were also things I couldn't really explain for myself. Like, for example, I would hear and often repeat myself the idea that the old city has four quarters. And you see it in the archaeological books. Most people are just borrowing from what they've heard, or, assuming the grid that they've received. And I always wondered, where did these four quarters come from, for example? And I couldn't really find an answer. So I had to do a lot of digging on my own, which took me back to the Ottoman period and, really got me interested in late Ottoman Jerusalem. So the newsletter is a place for me to both work out those questions for myself, try to write things I think are interesting, and as a landing pad for issues that I'm discovering in my own, dissertation research and, research related to the dissertation. I also wanted to make it a space where I would try to track Jerusalem, the publications and developments in Jerusalem, because I realized that so many scholars are writing about Jerusalem and are researching it, but they're not all talking to each other, either because they're from different sides of an ideological divide, or because they're writing about different periods, or simply because there's so much material out there that they haven't seen what someone else has written. And so I wanted to create a space where I would, to the best of my ability, track new publications of Jerusalem, books, articles, new websites that comment on Jerusalem, videos, podcasts, such as this one, and developments in the city, to try to help people keep up with the larger conversation that's going on about Jerusalem. I don't know how successful you can be trying to do something like that, but that's a goal that I have. So periodically I'll publish what's called the Jerusalem Tracker newsletter, where I try to track all the new stuff that's out there on the city. And I miss some, and I update it later. But hopefully it's a way for scholars to stay up to date, and just people from the interested public about, what has been published, both in the scientific journals, let's say, and in pop media archaeological platforms and everywhere else, just for anyone who's interested in the city.
Your latest article on the website talks about something I was not even aware of, this idea of flattening Jerusalem's terrain, which, if I understood correctly, was the idea of using artificial platforms essentially to flatten Jerusalem. So I was wondering if you can just give us a sense of what you've wrote in this short article.
Yeah, so what I wanted to talk about was, everyone knows, for example, the Herodian Temple Mount project, where the topography of Jerusalem was reshaped into a platform there. That's the foundational courses that you can still see there at the Western Wall, and then other parts, around the base of the noble sanctuary. That's one example, but there were others, and I started to notice that it's kind of a, let's say, part of the geographical genre of the city, that different rulers in antiquity flattened out the terrain to build monumental projects. So another example would be on the Western Hill, just inside Jaffa Gate. Herod the Great built there, as best we can tell, his Western Palace. And it must have been enormous and beautiful in antiquity, but we have almost nothing from it left over of the superstructure. What we do have are the subterranean retaining walls that were built to construct an artificial platform on which the palace was built. So you have evidence of it really only in excavations, and you don't see it above ground. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't continued to influence the shape of the city after Herod's days. So the project was both looking at where these artificial platforms are and looking at how they've continued to shape the topography of Jerusalem, since they were constructed. So, for example, if you come in Jaffa Gate today and you hang a right, go by the Citadel on your right-hand side, Christ Church on your left-hand side, and you begin to walk south on Armenian Patriarchate Street, you'll notice that street is very level. And if in all the spaces along the street where you can look to the right, you'll see that there's a parking lot there in the southwestern corner of the old city, and other pieces of the terrain that are fairly level. That's not the case in other parts of the city. And if you keep walking east from there, any of the streets basically that go east, whether it's David Street, down into the bazaar, right out of Jaffa Gate, or following Armenian Patriarchate Street around as it bends past the inside of Zion Gate, the terrain begins to drop in elevation. And you feel that, as you walk. So people may wonder, as they're walking, are we just on a high point of the hill, or what's going on here? And the answer there is kind of both and. It is the high point of the Western Hill, but also this terrain was shaped in antiquity by Herod the Great's palace project. And so you feel the effect of the platform even, as you walk there today. And Herod also covered over earlier remains when he had this platform built. So there's kind of a dual, you can look at it two different ways. Or I tried to in the article, which is looking at how the platform shaped experiences of Jerusalem after Herod, and looking at how it reshaped the pre-existing terrain. Because my dissertation question is the Iron Age, right? So before Herod the Great. That means that we have to, as best we can with all the tools available, try to understand what the terrain looked like before this massive platform was built, over it. So Herod is reshaping something that's there. And in a lot of cases, what we see there is evidence of quarrying and walls that may be part of houses, may be part of terraces that made up, that were used for agriculture. There's different interpretations for it, but whatever interpretation we give to it, we have to deal with the platform that Herod built. And there's other examples, like the Herodian Temple Mount. I looked at the Nia Church also of Justinian, which was built in the 6th century, and the area around where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is today, which was the Forum in the Roman period and the Byzantine period. So that area was flattened out as well.
Actually, you mentioned the Nia Church, and I was reminded that I would say the largest majority of visitors, particularly Christian visitors, when visiting the city, they obviously either go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or depending on the denomination, they may go to the Garden Tomb just outside the walls of Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. But very little is known about the Nia Church, which was the most important church in Jerusalem. And if I remember well, and you mentioned that in the article, it's only after 1967 that finally some evidence of what was known was found. And so we have an idea about the size and the location of the church. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the missing piece here. I mean, what was the Nia Church and what did it represent for the Christians in Jerusalem?
Yeah, so the Nia Church, like I said, was built in the 6th century by Emperor Justinian. It was a church that was built in honor of Mary, and it was a lot of archaeologists will talk about it as kind of a southern balance to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So you have two large, churches, one in the middle and one on the southern side of the city. But as best we can tell, it was bigger building actually than the Holy Sepulchre. I wouldn't say it was a more important building, but definitely larger, on the landscape. The building was known. We have historians who wrote about it. So we knew that it stood in antiquity, but we didn't know exactly where it was. Toward the end of the 19th century in Madaba, Jordan, a lot of your listeners will probably be familiar with the Madaba map, which is a mosaic map in a church there that shows the Holy Land right around this time. Most scholars date it to the 6th century, or just after. And in the middle of that map was Jerusalem, an enlarged ideological picture of Jerusalem. And there's definitely theological interpretation going on, which anyone studying the map will discuss. But the map does show visible architecture in 6th century Jerusalem that we can demonstrate was there. I mean, you can see the foundation, the projecting towers underneath what's today Damascus Gate on the map. And if you go to the area of the excavations in Damascus Gate today, you can see the foundation of those towers. And then the Cardo Maximus, the main street that ran north-south in Jerusalem, is kind of a defining feature of the Madaba map's depiction of the city. And on the southern end of it, we see a large building that scholars interpreted as the Nia Church before evidence of it was found after 1967. So we knew sort of where it was after we had the Madaba map. Before that time, there were scholars kind of put it all over the place and sort of guessed different locations, including some scholars thought it was in the area where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is today, which is kind of funny. But if we wrote in the middle of the 19th century, maybe we would have assumed that, too, with the data they had at their disposal. But the church came off of the Cardo Maximus, and so it kind of anchors the southern side of it. And, it sat just on the eastern part of the Cardo there. You can see if you are walking down to the area of Dung Gate today and you're on that road, it's a paved road, look out because there's taxis and cheroots and stuff that will fly by on that road. But on the way down to Dung Gate, just on the right-hand side of the road, so the south side, one of the apses of the Nia Church is exposed. It's the southern apse, one of the smaller ones. And so you can see it there. There's a little sign, that highlights it. It could definitely be more prominent, but that's the only piece of it that's really visible. There's part of the structure of subterranean vaults sits just nearby, but I think that area has been boarded up now. You definitely can't go in there unless you know somebody who can get you in. But that area and the parking lot adjacent, that same parking lot you were talking about, Roberto, by the bakery that you like, that's the area of the Nia Church there.
I have one more question, which is very much about your period in Jerusalem during COVID. Now, had you been back in the US, in Michigan, where you're from, probably would have been very different. We had restrictions, but not the same level as in Israel. And so I was wondering, how was life during COVID in Jerusalem?
It was absolutely wild. And for a lot of reasons, but the country was closed. Nobody could come in, and your listeners will know well that tourism is a huge part of the economy, and it's something that keeps a lot of people working. And so that mechanism was shut off. I was working at a university where we depended on student groups coming in, and we depend on experiential learning with students in physical spaces. And to not have that meant that we did what everybody else did, which is that we took things online and tried to make the programs accessible. That was difficult. There were lockdowns, 3 of them, if I remember right. The whole period is kind of a blur, I think, for a lot of us. But where we couldn't go more than, say, 500 meters from our house, except for essential services. Usually those overlapped different holidays to try to keep, people at home. But it was very interesting because with no tourists in the country, I had experiences that I probably will never have again. For example, I was in Bethlehem one time. I was taking videos for a geography class I was teaching at the time because I wanted the students to be able to experience the landscape, by video at least, if they couldn't be there. And anybody who goes to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem knows that you normally stand in a long line to wait and go down into the grotto to the, reputed spot where Jesus was born. And I just walked right down to the basement there, and there was nobody in there. And I sat there for probably the better part of 40 minutes by myself and just sat in the space and, looked around and made observations and kind of sat in the, in the moment. I think one person came down and then left. I will certainly never have that kind of an experience again. I had a similar experience in the Tomb of Christ and the Holy Sepulchre, where I just stood in there for minutes by myself. And, it was a strange time because you were both excited for what you were able to do as an individual, but also aware of how much it was, the situation was hurting people, both just the relationships in general and the ability of the, the tourist mechanism to get going again, and all these programs in Jerusalem and throughout the country, which depend on people coming in. But one thing I did during COVID was I got really interested in the Ottoman city. And I had always been interested in what's called the Ordnance Survey of Jerusalem in 1865, which was undertaken by Charles Wilson, a British royal engineer, who came to the city to ostensibly help with develop the water supply. But to do that created the first scientific map of Jerusalem that really had, sharp detail and elevations above sea level. And in different places in the city, Charles Wilson and his team etched benchmarks in the city walls and in buildings. And they took elevation readings from the horizontal bar at the top of these benchmarks. And I'd always known about the one at Jaffa Gate on the lower, as you're walking into the gate, it's on the lower, right-hand part of the gate structure. But I'd heard about a few others and seen a few others, but I wondered if I could find them all. And so I started to track them on the Ordnance Survey map, and I realized that he had their position marked out. And so I surveyed them, labeled them all and surveyed them and tried to see how many of them still existed, because antiquity law doesn't protect the benchmarks because they're not old enough to be considered, antiquity. And yet they're an important part of Jerusalem's, from the Ottoman period and, from the beginning of British interests. And there's a whole discussion there. But I wanted to understand where they are and how many have been lost. And so that was a fun project for me during COVID. So between breaks, when we could go out in the city again, I would go out and hunt these things and walk around and smell the bread, like we were talking about earlier, masked, of course, until they got rid of their mask mandate. But in the July sun, walking around in Jerusalem in hiking boots and a mask, it was a wild experience.
You just reminded me something similar I did. I think it was 2004 or 5, and I had this 1907 tourist guide published by the Franciscans. And I tried to essentially follow the tours that they were recommending, and just trying to figure out what did change. And obviously, most of the things that really changed was about businesses, and some of them were still there, perhaps under different names, but you still recognize sort of a structure of the original business a century later. I guess my last question is there anything that we didn't discuss, throughout this conversation, or whether about your work, your experience in Jerusalem, but that you want to point out?
I don't think so. We could talk for hours, about all facets of Jerusalem. I think for me, I try to do justice to the city from the ground up, looking at the geography, understanding the contours of the natural topography that's there and the visible city, the physical city that we have, and understand the way that the city developed in antiquity and until today, and how that reflects both the people who are living there now and the people who live there, in antiquity. You read a lot of writing about Jerusalem that's really good and that's connected to the city, the physical city, and then some scholarship that hasn't been influenced by the physical aspects of the city. And there's some justification for that. A lot of the biblical material is hard to date that describes Jerusalem, or physical aspects of Jerusalem, and we may not be able to tell what exactly that text is referring to. And it could even just be a purely ideological reference, in the text, not to anything, specific or physical in the city. But I try with my scholarship as best I can to connect the Jerusalem we see in text, very carefully, and when well understood, with the physical Jerusalem that we have. Because these texts they emanated from a real city. They were written by people who experienced a real place. And so that's kind of my approach, whether we're talking about the Iron Age or the Ottoman period.
This was Chandler Collins. Chandler is currently a Ph.D. researcher at Bar Ilan University, and is working on Jerusalem during the Iron Age. He's a photographer, and also is the author of Approaching Jerusalem, a newsletter available online, and I will post all of the links on the podcast notes. Chandler, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Roberto.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.